Today's video lecture looks at the various interpretations of Hume's copy thesis. Hume's copy thesis, or copy principle, is not particularly well received among modern philosophers. But instead of spending too much time on the flat-out rejections of the theory, we're going to concentrate on the ways that philosophers have tried to make sense of Hume's view. As we'll see, it hasn't been easy to find a fully consistent way to do it. The last video lecture introduced Hume's theory of impressions and ideas as it is explained in the opening section of Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. We saw that Hume proposes that all simple ideas are copies of simple impressions, which means, roughly, that we receive immediate sensory data in the form of impressions, and then we mentally take up those simple impressions as simple ideas that are copied from the immediate impression. And this is what is called Hume's copy thesis, or some have called it his copy principle. Last time I described the principle as indirect realist because it involves having our sensations come in direct contact with the world, but our thoughts, since they originate as copies of that direct contact, are only indirectly in contact with the world. This applies both to our engagement with the physical world and with our thoughts about our immediate feelings and emotions. Both physical sensation and our feelings and emotions come to us as immediate impressions first, then as ideas that are copies of those impressions. Hume tells us that one of the key differences between impressions and ideas is that impressions have greater force and vivacity. The immediate feeling of engagement with the world or with our feelings will always be stronger than our thoughts about them. Our minds take up these impressions as ideas that are directly related to the impressions they are copied from. Why are ideas less forceful and vivid? It's because they're copies. We can think of it a little like this. It makes sense that copies are going to lose the vivacity and sharpness of the original. If you have a very sharp original, you may get a very sharp copy. But if you have a rather hazy original impression, then the idea is going to be even more hazy. So, in a nutshell, that is Hume's copy thesis. But as we'll see in this lecture, philosophers have found that under analysis, Hume's proposal leaves a lot of outstanding questions. One of those questions, the one we'll focus on in today's lecture, is what precisely it is that makes an impression and an idea an idea. Hume suggests that this is obvious, but he also gives us a number of exceptions, such that the criteria for what makes something one or the other starts to fall apart. For example, are impressions always less vivid than ideas? Is this the criteria? If it is, then that would suggest that any idea that is very vivid is an impression. But that doesn't seem right. Are all impressions by definition vivid? What about faint or indistinct feelings or sensations? Maybe it's that impressions always precede ideas, so that, by definition, whatever comes first is an impression, and whatever comes second is an idea. But, as we'll see, there are exceptions to this proposal as well. Looking at Hume's own words doesn't make it fully clear. The problem is that, in one breath, Hume says that the distinction between impression and idea is obvious, and then with the next he gives us examples for when the distinction isn't obvious at all. He says this right at the very beginning of the treatise. I believe it will not be very necessary to employ many words in explaining the distinction between impressions and ideas. Every one of himself will readily perceive the difference betwixt feeling and thinking. The common degree of these are easily distinguished. Though it is not impossible, but in particular instances they may very nearly approach to each other. Thus, in sleep, in a fever, in madness, or in very violent emotions of soul, our ideas may approach to our impressions. As, on the other hand, it sometimes happens that our impressions are so faint and low that we cannot distinguish them from our ideas. But notwithstanding this near resemblance in a few instances, they are in general so very different that no one can make a scruple to rank them under distinct heads, and assign to each a peculiar name to mark the difference. So what did he just tell us there? He started off by saying that the distinction is so obvious that he doesn't think he needs to waste much breath explaining it. And then he talks about dreams and hallucinations and other cases where he admits that the distinction is hard to discern. So what then are we to make of this? What makes an impression and an idea an idea? What is the definition that we can use to explain why something like a hallucination is not an impression, while a barely heard sound is not an idea? The Rickless article that I've assigned for this week's reading looks specifically at this question. Rickless is specifically interested in the following question: what makes a perception an idea as opposed to an impression? He considers the ways different philosophers have tried to answer this question and finds that there are 6 different views on the question. They are: 1. The Force and Vivacity view, 2. The Causal Priority view, 3. The Copy Principle view, 4. The Objective Realm view, 5. The Feeling Thinking view, and finally 6. The Reflection view. Rickless argues that the first 5 of those are inadequate, that they each have some issue with them that prevents them from acting as a sufficient definition. He proposes the 6th view, the reflection view, as what he thinks operates as a better and more encompassing account of Hume's own view. He writes, "An important part of Hume's philosophy is grounded in a fundamental distinction between 2 kinds of perceptions, impressions and ideas. I argue that all of these views of the distinction, force and vivacity, causal priority, copy principle, objective realm, and feeling thinking, are problematic and should be replaced by the reflection view, according to which simple ideas are, while impressions are not, the direct products of reflection on other perceptions." One of the reasons why philosophers cannot agree on what Hume's definition of an impression versus that of an idea is that most of the wording Hume himself uses is subject to exceptions. So, for example, is it true that ideas are always less vivid than impressions? What about dreams or hallucinations? These are, or at least can be, very vivid and forceful. But Hume tells us that these are ideas and not impressions, no matter how vivid they may appear to be. But the question is why? Not only why are hallucinations an idea and not an impression, but does the fact that hallucinations are so vivid present a problem for Hume's whole theory? Can he explain to us what the difference is between a strong hallucination and a genuine sensory experience? I'll play you a brief video clip that illustrates a kind of vivid hallucination that seems particularly hard to fit into Hume's copy thesis. It's a video of artist Yayoi Kusama describing her artistic process that involves direct engagement with vivid hallucination.
そしてニューヨークでもって私は死に物狂いで戦いました。美術のことで、そして一生懸命絵を描き、細かい網目の作品を作って、そしてそれが33フィートの大きさになるの。朝から晩までその網を描いておりました。 ね、私がね絵を描いてるとね、そしてその絵がね床を見るとその絵がね発展してって、向こうを見るとね幻覚が来て、全部ね幻覚になって渦まって、それでね結局私はねエンバイロメンタル超芸術家としてね発展することになってました。
So the way Kusama explains it, her hallucination of the dots was both very powerful and very vivid. She describes them with all the language we would use to describe a sensory experience. But we know already that Hume emphatically insists that what she is describing is not an impression of dots, but an idea of them. She tells us that the image of dots filled the room around her canvas, and that vision inspired her art. She then painted the multiple dots that she was hallucinating. But that would mean that Hume's order is reversed. She would have had the hallucination, i.e. the idea, first, and then painted something in the objective or real world, i.e. an impression, that copies the hallucination. In other words, it sounds like we have an example of an idea preceding an impression, which Hume says is not how it works. Impressions are supposed to come first. Her hallucination also sounds very vivid and forceful, perhaps more vivid and forceful than she's able to reproduce on canvas. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Hume is wrong. He would probably tell us that, for example, Kusama could not have had hallucinated the dots had she never seen a dot before in her life. In this case, we might assume that Hume would disregard the fact that the hallucination/idea was more vivid and apparently preceded the image in the objective world. This is the kind of explanation that Rickless is after. We might also agree that Kusama's hallucination is not an impression, meaning not a sensory experience. But by what criteria? What is the definition of impression such that it excludes Kusama's hallucinated dots? What is the definition of an idea such that it does include them? That's what Rickless is investigating in his article. The question he poses of the 6 proposed views of Hume's impressions and ideas is whether they give us a good working definition of these terms, so that we can understand why Hume would say that Kusama's hallucination is not an impression. He asks, does the proposed view explain why Hume says X is an impression, or why he says Y is an idea? So in this sense, Rickless is not actually critiquing Hume's copy thesis. He's taking for granted that Hume is right, and that our job is to find the interpretation that best understands him. The target of his critique is not Hume, but other scholars, others who have tried to interpret Hume's meaning. But note that this isn't necessarily the typical approach to Hume's copy thesis. A lot of contemporary philosophers have concluded that the principle is simply wrong, often because it doesn't explain the difference between a hallucination and a sensory experience, and because it has too many counterexamples to sustain it. Here's one example of a present-day philosopher's take on the principle, not really an uncommon one. Jonathan Ichikawa of the University of British Columbia writes, is an image different in kind from a percept? Hume notoriously thought not. Impressions and ideas differ only in degree of vivacity. Hume writes, that idea of red which we form in the dark, and that impression which strikes our eyes in sunshine, differ only in degree, not in nature. As many authors have observed, this simple picture is surely wrong. Vivid images can be more vivid than our faint percepts. As we'll see in today's lecture and our close look at Rickless's article, Ichikawa is taking issue here with just one interpretation of Hume's copy thesis. On Rickless's account, Ichikawa is right to point out that there are ideas that are more vivid than impressions. But this isn't a problem with Hume's thinking, says Rickless. This is specifically a problem with the force and vivacity view of the impression/ideas distinction. So let's look first at that view. Rickless argues that it is inadequate as an explanation for Hume's distinction between impressions and ideas. He writes, the force and vivacity view is that the criterial difference between impressions and ideas is that the former are forceful and vivid, while the latter are faint and weak. The main problem with the force and vivacity view is that it does not classify perceptions in the way that Hume does. If impressions differ from ideas only in degree of force and vivacity, then we should find Hume saying that forceful and vivid hallucinations, memory perceptions, and beliefs are impressions. Unfortunately, Hume claims that such experiences are ideas. Rickless argues that the force and vivacity view suffers from what he calls the problem of extensional inadequacy. What does that mean? That was a very jargony way of saying that he thinks that the force and vivacity view has a categorization problem. It forces us to categorize as impressions things that Hume calls ideas, and things as ideas that Hume calls impressions. So what Rickless wants, since at least in this article he's presuming that Hume's theory is coherent while the interpretations of it are not, is a view of Hume's distinction that perfectly matches his own demarcations of what is and what is not an impression or idea. We do know that Hume himself, right off the bat, tells us that impressions have more force and vivacity than ideas. This is what Hume says. Those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we may name impressions, and under this name I comprehend all our sensations, passions, and emotions, as they first make their appearance in the soul. By ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning, such as, for instance, are all the perceptions excited by the present discourse. But what Rickless suggests is that Hume is not meaning to give us a definition of impressions and ideas in that passage. What Hume is doing is giving us one example of how impressions and ideas differ. But Rickless thinks that that force and vivacity is not meant to be understood as a definition of these two kinds of mental objects or of perceptions. Force and vivacity are, Rickless argues, just a kind of general rule. Generally speaking, impressions are more forceful and vivid than ideas. And here's another point that the force and vivacity view and also Ichikawa get wrong. These philosophers who say that some impressions are faint and some ideas are vivid misunderstand Hume by thinking that he means that all impressions are always more vivid than all ideas. But Rickless points out that the relationship between impressions and ideas is more specific than that, meaning that a specific idea is typically going to be fainter than the specific impression it originates from. This is a point I made above. The quality of a copy is dependent on how good the original was. That means that a strong impression, like the smell of a rose, will have a fairly vivid and strong idea associated with it. The idea will inevitably be weaker than the original impression, but since the impression was so strong, the idea is going to be stronger than, say, an idea of trees and other shapes in the fog. Here the impression itself is weak and hard to make out. That means that the idea of what these trees are actually like is going to be even weaker. And so it makes sense to say that the idea of the smell of a rose is going to be fairly strong and vivid, while the impression of the park bench in this photo is very weak. Likewise, a powerful hallucination, an idea, might be stronger and more vivid than your impression of a man walking in the distance in fog. It's a one-to-one relation, not a generally applied rule. And because it's just a general rule and not a hard and fast definition, it means that there can be exceptions. For example, perhaps for Scrooge, the hallucination of the ghost of Jacob Marley, or the sound of his clanking chains, was at least as strong as his original impressions. But that doesn't mean that those were real impressions. It means, rather, that Scrooge's experience was an exception to the general rule. Here's Rickless. Note that Hume also claims that the difference between impressions and ideas is original. The different degrees of force make all the original difference betwixt an impression and idea. This suggests another way to understand the role that vivacity plays in relation to Hume's distinction. When an impression first enters the mind, it is vivid. That impression is then copied, and the idea of it that is formed at that time is always and inevitably less vivid than the impression from which it is copied. This is an original difference in vivacity between a simple impression and the simple idea that it represents, or that represents it. From this, Rickless concludes that the force and vivacity view is flawed. If this was the definitional criteria between an impression and an idea, we'd have all sorts of ideas in the impression column and all sorts of impressions in the ideas column. It's not Hume who's wrong here, it's the interpretation. Rickless writes, rather than contradicting himself or engaging in exaggeration, I suggest that Hume is actually somewhat infelicitously trying to convey two propositions that he takes to be, and that in fact are, mutually compatible. One, that impressions are generally or naturally, and also originally, more vivid than ideas. And two, that some impressions are as vivid as some ideas. Rickless concludes that the force and vivacity view does not allow an explanation for why some ideas are forceful while some impressions are weak. He writes, in other words, it is reasonable to suppose that Hume would want his readers to understand him to be saying not that ideas and impressions could not possibly possess the same degree of force and vivacity, but that ideas are generally or originally less forceful and vivid than the impressions from which they are copied. I conclude that the force and vivacity view cannot escape from the problem of extensional inadequacy by appealing to the exaggeration hypothesis, which proposes that Hume is exaggerating when he says that hallucinations are as vivid as impressions. Okay, so that was the force and vivacity view, probably the most commonly held interpretation, at least among those who think Hume's copy principle is flat out wrong. But there are other options. Let's look at the causal priority view. The causal priority view also draws from Hume's own wording. There are places where Hume suggests that impressions cause ideas, and so must always precede them. So the causal priority view takes this as the central definition of impressions and ideas. What distinguishes an impression from an idea is that an impression is the cause and the idea is the effect. This would mean that whatever comes first is the impression, and whatever comes second is the idea. Here's Rickless explaining why this view can't be fully right. He writes, one worry about the causal priority view is that not all impressions in the mind are temporally prior to ideas. As Hume emphasizes, In many, though not all cases, impressions of reflection, such as desires and aversions, hope and fear, are caused by, and hence are temporally and causally posterior to, the idea of pleasure and pain. So it cannot be that what distinguishes impressions from ideas is that all instances of the former temporally precede all instances of the latter. In other words, there are cases where Hume suggests certain ideas that are causally prior to impressions, especially in the case of ideas of reflection on inner feelings and sentiments. Another problem with this causal priority explanation is that it isn't true that all ideas are caused by impressions. Complex ideas, for example, are caused by simple ideas. Abstract ideas are caused by complex ideas that are divorced from their original impressions. This means that, as a definition, you can't really say that what defines an idea is that it is caused by an impression. An idea can be caused by another idea, or an impression can, in cases of internal reflection, be caused by an idea. But there's another problem with the causal priority view. Rickless writes, "A more serious objection to the causal priority view stems from the way in which Hume argues for the copy principle. As Flagg and Norton, two defenders of this view, themselves recognize, Hume's argument for the copy principle relies on experience and observation. It is by constant experience that Hume finds that the simple impressions always take precedence of their correspondent ideas, and that any impression, either of the mind or body, is constantly followed by an idea which resembles it." Rickless's point here is that experience shows us that the impression usually precedes the idea, meaning that we acquire the information about what is an impression and what is an idea through experience, meaning a posteriori, through observation. Hume, of course, is an empiricist, and so he thinks that we don't have any knowledge a priori. And so, Rickless argues, Hume cannot be saying that by definition an impression must precede an idea. Because, first of all, that kind of thinking violates Hume's own philosophical position about the nature of perception. Why? Because it implies a kind of a priori universal rule, which, as we'll talk about more in the next video, Hume thinks is entirely not like how we experience the world. It would be very strange if Hume were positing some kind of necessary causal connection between impressions and ideas, when Hume's whole philosophy of perception is based on the argument that there is no such thing as necessary causal connections, something that we'll get into in depth next time. So that's one major strike against the causal priority view. Just as he did with the force and vivacity view, Rickless argues that the fact that impressions almost always precede ideas is once again a general rule, and not a definition of impressions and ideas. Once again, like the general rule that impressions are more forceful and vivid, causal priority is also more like an observation about another way that impressions and ideas differ. Let's move to the next view, which is similar to the causal priority view. Rickless thinks that despite the similarities, those similarities are largely superficial because the copy principle view does add something new and important to the interpretation of how Hume thinks the mind distinguishes impressions and ideas. On the copy principle view, ordinary folk, meaning not philosophers who feel the need to define every step of our thought processes, we sort perceptions intuitively into impressions and ideas at a pre-thinking level. The mind is automatically able to recognize and distinguish what is an original and what is a copy. Perhaps the reason it's so hard for Hume to define these is because of this. It's not by any conscious process that we decide what an impression is or what an idea is. It's something the mind does on its own, at a preconscious level. And so the mind itself intuitively recognizes that an impression is directly sensed, while an idea is copied. And so the definitional distinction is merely this, that an idea is what is copied from an impression. Rickless thinks that this would have more merit if it weren't for the counterexamples. Specifically, that missing shade of blue. We saw this last time. Hume himself acknowledges that there are some very rare, very specific cases where we get a simple idea not from an impression, but from the imagination. Hume acknowledges that the mind can get an idea of the missing shade of blue here even without any preceding impression of it. So here we have an example of at least one simple idea that is not copied from an impression. Hume doesn't conclude from the missing shade of blue example that that shade is an impression on account of it not being a copy of anything. Hume says that the missing shade is nonetheless still an idea, not an impression. Rickless considers how philosophers who have defended the copy principle view respond to this problem. They say that the missing shade of blue is, quote, as good as a copy, even if it isn't actually a real copy. Here's Rickless. One problem with Landy's reply is that the as good as a copy relation is not the same as the straightforward copy relation. As close to a copy as the idea of the missing shade might be, it is not, according to Hume, a real copy of any precedent perceptions. But the result of Hume's empirical investigation of impressions and ideas is not that every simple idea is as good as a copy of a simple impression. The result is that every simple idea is a real copy of a simple impression. So Landy's conception of how the copy principle might handle the missing shade of blue counterexample does not fit with the way Hume introduces, deploys, and defends the principle. But that's not what Rickless thinks is the biggest problem for the copy principle. The bigger problem is that it suffers the same flaw as a causal priority view, meaning that it posits a necessary causal connection between impressions and ideas in a way that violates Hume's empiricism. We saw this already. This means that, like causal priority, the view applies an a priori rule to perception. When Hume argues that we recognize the difference between impressions and ideas a posteriori. This, Rickless thinks, is too deep a flaw to be credible, and so he dismisses the copy principle view as well. All right, moving along. The objective realm view. This view proposes that the distinction between impression and idea is that impressions occur in the objective realm, meaning they come from an external physical reality, while ideas come from a non-physical, mental, or inner state. Here's Rickless. As Bennett describes the distinction, impressions occur only in experience of the objective realm, while ideas occur only in thinking and reasoning. As we've seen, Hume takes there to be a fundamental difference in kind between sense perception and the hallucinations of a madman. For adherents of the objective realm view, the former are, while the latter are not, experiences had when people really perceive physical objects. And the thought is that it is this difference that grounds the impression-idea distinction. There's some intuitive plausibility here, A lot of the language I've used to talk about impressions and ideas draws on this distinction. But that's because I'm focusing this course on our engagement with the external world of objects. With regards to those objects, we could say that, yes, our impression of red is coming from an external red object, while our idea of the red happens after the object is removed, and so it's not coming from some objective realm. But here's one problem with this, one that Rickless doesn't talk about. Suggesting that impressions are from the objective realm, while ideas are from an internal non-physical realm, suggests, as we've seen in Berkeley's critique of Locke, a jump from physical to non-physical. This suggests that impressions would be very different from ideas. They'd be of a physical realm. But Hume insists that impressions and ideas are not different in nature. They are supposed to differ only in degree. Remember that he said this: that idea of red which we form in the dark and that impression which strikes our eyes in sunshine differ only in degree, not in nature. That's not the point Rickless makes, though. Instead, he points out that not all impressions derive from the objective external world. Hume says that simple ideas of reflection have their source in simple impressions of emotions and feelings. Emotions and feelings are not of the objective realm at all. They are of the internal realm. That's two strikes against that view. Okay, last one before we get to Rickless's own view, the feeling-thinking view. This view has the benefit of drawing on what Hume himself actually seems to say defines impressions and ideas. This is what Hume says: I believe it will not be very necessary to employ many words in explaining the distinction. Everyone himself will readily perceive the difference betwixt feeling and thinking. Here's Rickless. One option that makes sense of some of what Hume says is to suppose that he means us to use the intuitive, pre-theoretical understanding of the distinction between feeling and thinking to draw the impression-idea distinction. We've already seen that Hume thinks that everyone will readily perceive the difference between feeling and thinking. Perhaps this is all there is to the distinction between impressions and ideas. Impressions are just those perceptions that are intuitively felt, while ideas are just those perceptions that are intuitively thought. But once again, there are counterexamples. Specifically, hallucinations. By the way, there's a reason why I keep returning to hallucinations, apart from the fact that they really are a vexing issue for Hume's copy thesis. You may have noticed that the second final essay option specifically references the example of hallucinations. I'm hoping that your Hume essay, if you take that option, will take a look more closely at whether Hume in fact does or can explain hallucinations to us. At any rate, here's Rickless explaining why hallucinations work as a counterexample to the feeling-thinking distinction between impressions and ideas. He writes, the main problem with this view is that some of the perceptions Hume classifies as ideas are clearly felt, if anything is. Recall that Hume takes hallucinations to be ideas, not impressions. But there's no doubt that in an intuitive or pre-theoretical sense of felt, many, perhaps all, hallucinations are felt. Indeed, it is precisely the fact that hallucinations are phenomenally indistinguishable from veridical sensations that leads both patients and diagnosticians to describe them as felt. So Hume's unequivocal classification of hallucinations as ideas is inconsistent with the feeling-thinking view, according to which ideas are defined as perceptions that are intuitively thought, but not felt. We've come full circle then. This is what Ichikawa was complaining about with Hume's theory. The issue with the feeling-thinking distinction between impressions and ideas is that it cannot explain to us why the ideas that come from an hallucination or a dream are not impressions, but ideas. One possible reason why it's so hard to find a clear and consistent definition of Hume's impressions and ideas could be, perhaps you've thought of it already, that Hume is just wrong to try to divide up sensation and thought this way. Maybe it would just be easier to say, like Berkeley did, that it's all ideas and just simplify the whole thing that way. Or maybe you could say, like Reid, that this is all unnecessary. Let's just say that you think of impressions and leave it at that. It does seem to be the case that when you really look at it, there isn't a clear way to distinguish these two things. Impressions and ideas are perhaps so alike that maybe they should be seen as being of the same thing. But that's not how Rickless sees it. There is another option left, one that Rickless thinks does clarify the distinction Hume is trying to make here between impressions and ideas. And that brings us at last to the reflection view. Now, I'm going to be adding an extra layer to Rickless's analysis, one that I think is apt and in line with both what Rickless is saying and with what Hume is saying. And it also has the benefit of tying into the major overarching theme of the course. I'm going to suggest to you that the way Rickless resolves this issue about impressions and ideas is by identifying Hume's theory as representationalist. Rickless thinks that the problem with the preceding 5 views is that they neglect the rest of Hume's theory of perception. That theory, Rickless notes, just as I did in the last video, sees the imagination as playing a crucial role in perception. Rickless notes not just the role of the imagination, though. He points to multiple mental acts that Hume sees as intimately involved in how the mind engages with the world, both internal and external. I've identified these as 4 faculties: 1 perception, 2 memory, 3 imagination, and 4 reflection. Rickless doesn't explicitly identify perception as one of the faculties, but I've added it here for clarity since I think he's assuming it as a first step. Here's Rickless. Hume thinks the mind does things with its perceptions, some of them through its faculty of imagination. Thanks to this faculty, the mind is free to transpose and change its ideas. The imagination, Hume says, is the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the material afforded us by the sense and experience. That was imagination, largely a review of at least part of what we talked about in the last video. Here's Rickless describing the function of memory, also a review of what we covered last time. The imagination is not the only faculty in Hume's mental economy responsible for mental acts. The memory is a power of copying perceptions as ideas in such a way as to preserve their original order and position. And finally, there is reflection, which we didn't get to last time. He writes, another power that Hume mentions several times is the faculty of reflection. To reflect is to consider a perception as a perception, and think about, of, or on it as a whole. Unlike mixing, combining, separating, and dividing, reflection is a second-order mental operation. Okay, we just got a new term there. By second-order mental operation, Rickless means a mental operation that acts on another mental operation. It's thus of the second order, meaning that it is a kind of second step after an initial, more basic mental operation. He goes on, with the help of my imagination, I can take a perception of white and put it together in the right way with the perceptions of a long, straight, spiraled horn. But with the help of my faculty of reflection, I can also reflect on or think about the first order perception of white, recognizing it as a perception of white. When I do this, I form a second order perception, one that represents the first order perception of white. This new second order perception, the direct product of the mental operation of reflection applied to the mind's perceptions, is an idea. Indeed, according to the reflection view, to be the direct product of the mental act of reflection on a perception is precisely what it is to be an idea. Every other perception in the mind counts as an impression. So what does all that mean? It means that Rickless is giving us a possible definition of impression and idea that is based upon a more complete look at Hume's philosophy of mind. Rickless proposes that the true definition of an idea is that it is an object of reflection, whereas an impression is not. This means that an impression is a registration of raw sense data at a pre-thinking level. This makes an impression a first-order mental act. It is a preliminary, more basic kind of mental act that happens before thought. An idea, though, is a proper mental registration via reflection of that raw sense data. By reflection, Rickless means the perception that you are having a perception. It's the recognition that you are sensing something and have the ability to formulate a thought about it. I suggested this last time. It's the difference between biting into a chili pepper and having the thought, this chili pepper is hot. This makes an idea a second-order mental act. Hume tells us that all our true mental engagement with the world is through ideas, not direct sensation. And so this would mean that what we are engaging with directly is not the impressions themselves, but with the ideas that are copies of them. That means that these second-order mental acts, i.e. ideas, are the more immediate object of our thinking about the world. Those ideas / second-order mental acts are directly connected to impressions, but nonetheless one step removed from the source of those impressions. And this is why Hume is a representationalist and an indirect realist. What distinguishes ideas from impressions is that ideas are mental representations, while impressions are more like raw feels. On Rickless's account, this explanation of impressions and ideas gives us a definition that puts hallucinations into the ideas and not the impressions camp. Why? Because hallucinations and dreams are second-order mental acts. They may be vivid, they may seem like they are prior to engaging with the objective world, but they are ultimately a product of memory, imagination, and reflection, which means that they are not first-order impressions. And it explains why very faint sensations are still impressions. Why? Because they are not the product of memory, imagination, and reflection. They are more primary than that. They may be faint, but they are not the product of reflection and so fall under the category of first-order thought. And this would also fix the issue I raised earlier about the objective realm view. Distinguishing impression and idea according to first and second-order thought explains why Hume insists that impressions and ideas differ not in kind, but in degree. They're both mental acts. It's just that one comes before reflection and one comes after or through it. Now, Rickless is not emphasizing the point that Hume is giving us a representationalist theory of perception, but he does hint at it. He writes this: for Hume, the fact that ideas are formed by reflecting on perceptions helps explain why the former are usually representations of the latter, with the idea of the missing shade of blue functioning as a notable exception. To think of something is to form a representation of it. In other words, Hume's copy thesis requires that direct sense data, impressions, be converted to an object of reflection, ideas, as a basis for perception, or at least awareness of perception. I'm suggesting that what Rickless is basically identifying is that the various other views of Hume's impressions/ideas distinction gets it wrong because they are trying to interpret Hume as a direct realist when he's not. Rickless's view takes Hume's representationalism into account and so is able to find a clearer definition as a result. Rickless writes, "It is therefore unsurprising to find Hume saying in no fewer than 10 places in the treatise that ideas represent the things, usually impressions, they are about. The fact that ideas are representations of perceptions is therefore a natural consequence of the fundamental, critical property of ideas, namely, that they are formed by thinking about other perceptions." Now, I don't want to give you the impression that I think Rickless is 100% correct, or that his article is not subject to critique. You'll see in the reading quiz that I have asked you to think up a possible objection to Rickless's argument. In the automatic comments that you get once you submit the quiz, you'll see that I've proposed there what I think is a significant objection to Rickless's view. But I don't want to hint at that here because I'd like you to think about it yourselves. Is Rickless right? Or does his view also suffer from some conclusions that do not match what Hume says? Do we end up with a clear and coherent picture on Rickless's view of what an impression is and what an idea is? I'd like you to give it some critical thought. So, on that note, let's leave it here for today. Read the Rickless article if you haven't already and answer the reading quiz. Give it some serious thought. And even if you agree with Rickless, think about what someone who doesn't agree with him, perhaps a defender of one of the other views or perhaps a critic of Hume, might say in response to that reflection view. So that was our second lecture on Hume. Thank you everybody for listening. I will talk to you again soon. There will be another video posted by the end of the week.